Our political system is a precious commodity. Representative democracy is not something that should be taken for granted. This is particularly the case with our legislative branch of government. Not only do we, the voters, send representatives to convey our views, but our elected officials should also return to us with their information that is gained through the legislative process. That is, through the testimony that they gather and discussion that takes place in the legislature. It is only through such dialogue, that is, that which we send on to our elected representatives and that which they bring back to us, that a democracy can remain viable. My name is Pat Edgar, and I'm proud today to bring you an example of such a healthy dialogue that took place here in Missoula recently. During their transmittal break, your Missoula Democratic legislators had the opportunity to present and not only a report of their activities in Helena in the 51st Montana Legislature, but also their views of what we should expect in the near future. The presentation begins with Representative Vivian Brooke discussing some of the issues that she considers important to Missoulians.
Spending a lot of time in the Judiciary Committee in the House, and we've processed quite a number of bills. One of the bills that did not actually go through Judiciary but does have some bearing on the criminal justice and corrections process, one that I sponsored, was the women's prisons citing bill, and the process that bill is in now, it's gone through House State Administration Committee. What the bill does is to try to establish a site selection committee that will determine the site for the new women's prison. It's been over 10 years that we've been housing women in a temporary facility on the Warm Springs campus, and it's been determined fairly pretty solidly, I think, by a goodly number of legislators that it is time to build a new women's facility. There are 8 communities who have proposals into the Department of Institutions, and I'm very concerned that those proposals are viewed in a very impartial manner, and my bill sets out criteria, mandatory criteria and scored criteria by which this impartial site selection committee will judge how and where the facility will be built. I've been kind of shepherding that through the process. It's now in the Appropriations Committee, and one of the main decisions that the Appropriations Committee will have to make is to go with the plan of community-based funding through industrial revenue bonds, or to have the facility built through general obligation bonds as a state's responsibility. My bill allows for the general obligation bonding manner of funding, and I think that that's the appropriate way, since we're responsible for that facility, we're responsible for those inmates, and I think that as a state we're going to incur debt either way, and I think it's more upfront if we have it through general obligation bonding. Another bill that I've worked on in the recent weeks was to make it very clear that that there would be some revision of sex crimes in the statute, so that date rape was a very clear crime, and that the penalties and the kind of defense mechanisms that were built into the statutes that were very unfair are going to be eliminated, and that's moving through the process. That was moved through the House and now is going to the Senate. The one other thing with regard to criminal justice and corrections is that the Department of Institutions has in their budget plans for a new women's pre-release center, and I'm very interested that Missoula would take some interest in this, and I would encourage any of you who would want to write or gather a group together that would have some of these same interests in getting a pre-release center. The funding is probably going to be there. I think it will be approved. It's a much needed facility in the state, and Missoula is a prime location. We do have a pre-release center for women in Billings that houses about 12 women, and this would house 16, I think. It's what it's budgeted for. We don't have an application in for the women's prison, but I think a women's pre-release center, I think Missoula is a very, very good location for that, and there's a lot of interest. Pre-release centers are by law to be run by a private nonprofit corporation, so it would take a group of interested people in the community of Missoula, and I've been trying to get some time to get that impetus going through the county commissioners and some of the groups that I'm acquainted with, but just to toss that out, I think it's a good opportunity for us as Missoulians to show our support for that type of facility.
In continuing with criminal justice type issues, I've asked Senator Bob Pipinich to speak on some of the legislation that he's been involved in.
I'm Senator Bob Pipinich. I run in District 33, which is a fairly big district. It starts at Condon and goes to the Big Hole. I go into Missoula to half Anaconda. One of my big bills this year was arming the university security police. This has been tried a couple times before, but I guess the timing wasn't there. And with much help from Vicki Cocchiarella, Pinsonneau, Fred Van Valkenberg, we got the bill through. Our security police will be armed now 24 hours a day. That was quite a fight, and we got it through. The next one I'd like to talk about is Martin Luther King Day, which comes through my committee in state administration, which I vice chair. That was a big bill. It had about 7 different runs at it, from making Chief Joseph's Day and taking Columbus Day away and making that Chief Joseph's Day. But when it come out in the end, we done away with Heritage Day and made that Martin Luther King Day, which I think across the state everybody was pleased with. Not only the Indians, the blacks, and everybody else, they were pleased with that bill, and it went through. We were the 48th state in the United States to make it Martin Luther King Day. Another bill that I sponsored was having our GVW 8 officers getting soft body armor. Across the United States, there's been about 7 of these truckers out there that drove up to have their trucks weighed. They got into a little dispute, and one of the officers was shot. So we have them wearing soft body armor now. They cannot pack guns, but they'll have some protection. There was 3 or 4 other bills, but I won't get on. I think I can smell the chicken, so I'll quit it there. Thank you.
Also in the area of criminal justice issues, I've asked Representative Howard Toole to speak.
I'm Howard Toole, House District 60, the southwest part of town here. The biggest criminal justice bill that I carried was the home arrest bill, which was one of several bills that came out of an interim subcommittee on adult and juvenile corrections. That was a committee created by the last legislature to spend the 2 years between then and now studying the problem that we have with overcrowded jails, essentially. It's a serious problem all across the state. There are lots of jails that haven't been renovated since the 19th century. There are jails that are way overcrowded, as is Missoula's. Missoula is one of the real serious problem areas. I had a bill that was part of a package from that committee that authorizes the use of what's called home arrest, which means that people who would otherwise be placed in jail will actually stay at home, be forced to stay at home within the confines of the structure, and wear a wrist or ankle bracelet to be monitored, in effect, by telephone, so that it can be determined that they're there. That bill passed. There were a number of other bills that passed on to the Senate that have the same kind of structure, the same kind of idea, that is providing alternatives to jail, because we just have so many people in jail and we need more options to deal with them. There were a number of other bills. Vivian mentioned the bill on sex crimes. That is a major revision that incorporates the date rape now into our rape statutes. There used to be a bunch of defenses to date rape that made it very difficult to prosecute that. Those have been eliminated. There's a revision of the drunken driving statute, a major revision, and I'm not real sure how it's going to work out, but it changes the structure of what's called the presumptions for the amount of blood alcohol in the system. They're now called inferences, not presumptions, and there may be a difference in the way those are applied in the courts. There was a bill that I thought was a real bad move, a bill of Representative Vicki from Havre that makes lifelong prison terms mandatory for convictions of deliberate homicide. Representative Vicki feels that anyone who's convicted of deliberate homicide, regardless of the circumstances, regardless of what may have led to the crime, must spend their entire life without possibility of parole in prison. That bill was one of the kind of bills that you feel kind of compelled to vote in favor of, and only a few of us ended up voting against it. But I think that it kind of shows the schizoid nature of the criminal law in the House of Representatives. There were bills like the home arrest bill and others to create options and to kind of loosen up the system. There were other bills like this that really had the effect of tightening up the system. A couple of other areas outside the criminal law. There's the matter of immunity, which is a concern to me as a lawyer. I saw a number of bills come in to create pockets of immunity from liability for wrongdoing for particular industries. This is something that was presented for telephone companies and others. It was something I didn't think was particularly good public policy. I hope that we've got kind of a hold on that, so it's not going to continue. Election reform. I carried a bill that would enable people to file lawsuits in the event of violations of election laws. Individual election laws involving individual candidates are pretty well enforced by the Commissioner of Political Practices, but there are ballot issues where there are violations of law that are currently not being very well handled. They're kind of in limbo. My bill will enable those things to be treated in the courts, not just in the Office of the Commissioner of Political Practices. One of the bills that was real interesting the last few days was the retrocession bill. You've been reading about it in the paper. It affects Lake County mostly. It also affects Missoula County and Sanders to a limited extent. It returns to the Salish and Kootenai tribe jurisdiction that is now shared with the state courts over certain crimes. Very controversial issue in that county, but I think it's worth noting that retrocession goes contrary to the history of Indian policy in this country. For most of our history, we have declared that Indian tribes should be sovereign entities within our nation, that they should have jurisdiction over most of the matters that concern them, including crimes. But for a period in the 1960s and into the early 1970s, there was kind of a federal reversal of that policy, and it was during that time that the Salish and Kootenai tribe agreed to share their jurisdiction over crimes with the state courts of Montana. Having agreed to do that, they decided that that was not where they wanted to be, and none of the other Montana tribes, and relatively few of the tribes nationally, were doing that. So for a number of years, the tribe has desired to go back to the sovereignty concept that governed previously and which governs most of the tribes. The Democrats voted in favor of returning that sovereignty to the tribe, and it'll be an interesting issue. It's passed from the House into the Senate, and the Senate will face that same challenge. One last thing I want to mention is my school bill. I have a bill that I filed that would lengthen the school year. Over a course of several years, I would extend the school year up to 40 days. It's an expensive proposition, and it would mean extending the school year into the summer further than it is now. It's a concept that is starting to generate interest nationally. There was an article in the Atlantic Monthly in November, and there's been a lot of talk. There's bills introduced in Massachusetts and action in Maryland and a couple of other states. At this time, I have heard from Lester Thoreau of Massachusetts Institute of Technology in support of my bill. I haven't heard of very many Montanans at this point, but he's one. And this is something that is not going to happen right away, but it will be happening and discussed, I hope, as the years pass. So those are the areas that I was most interested in.
An area of particular interest in recent years, and actually in the long term, has been tax reform. And I have requested several of the members of the delegation to speak on this, and if I could first invite Representative Bob Ream to speak on the topic of tax reform.
Thanks, Pat. I just wanted to make a couple comments before I get into tax reform. First of all, I also serve on Natural Resources Committee, and I think there's been a lot happening in that area this session in the House Natural Resources Committee that I serve in, particularly with regard to solid waste management. We've set up a process whereby if there are any mega landfills that ever come into Montana, they'll have to go through a process much like our Major Facility Siting Act. In the tax reform area, this year for the first time in the House Taxation Committee, we split into two subcommittees, one dealing with income and natural resource taxation and the other with property tax, both complicated areas. And I think it's worked out really well, at least from the standpoint of an educational device, forcing legislators to, instead of dealing with one bill at a time and deciding whether or not they're going to pass it, to back up and look at the taxation system and the underlying assumptions in it, and try to come up with means of simplifying our tax system and making it more equitable. And I chair the Income and Natural Resource Taxation Subcommittee. And we have been looking at our Montana income tax and ways that we can simplify it. And we're looking at two approaches, both tying to our federal tax system, one tying directly to the Montana taxable income, using percentages that come right off of that, and the other looking at taxing our income based on federal liability. In other words, you figure out your federal tax and then take a straight percentage of that for our Montana taxes. And we've probably spent the most time on the latter approach, and it looks like it is considerably more progressive than our current tax system, partly because at the low income level, because of the high exemptions you get at the federal level, you're dropping a lot of people. In fact, it's estimated, I think 7,000 or 8,000 people in Montana would drop right off from our Montana income tax. And at the upper end, I think it brings in more consistency or more equitable system of taxation, partly because of the 1986 federal tax reform. So those are the things we're looking at there. Those will be popping out fairly soon. We've talked to the people in the Senate about it, and even a few Republicans on this approach, and I think there's considerable interest, at least at this point in time. I did want to say, we were asked to talk a little bit about the future. This next 45 days, the focus certainly will be on revenue and on spending. And at the current point in time, things don't look very bright, I would say. We came through the first part for the university system in fairly good shape. That is, money was added into the base, the 2.5% salary increases that were left out last time. That money is now into the base, and I think that's a very important step. Enrollment adjustments were also made, which favors the University of Montana. But right at this point in time, the last LFA, the Legislative Fiscal Analyst report, shows us with an ending fund balance of $17 million. Normally, we should have at least a $20 million ending fund balance just to allow for any slop in the system. That is, when I say slop, I mean revenue estimates. They don't necessarily always come in as we project, and for one thing, you all know the oil situation is really up and down. It's hard to predict what the revenue will be there. So we're essentially at zero. That is, with the spending allocations that the Appropriations Committee made, and what we need as an ending fund balance, that leaves us with zero. And we have at least three major items yet coming up. The state pay plan, which at 4 and 4 I think is about $40 to $50 million, somewhere in that range. The school foundation program, and any increases that we have for the university system. Those are the big three. And then there's all of the other cats and dogs bills, appropriations for this and that come in after the regular budgeting process. So things don't look good. I think if we're going to fund education, K through 12 education, and the pay plan, and I think that's imperative that we get some funding into the state pay plan, or we're going to see I think we're going to see some strikes next spring or summer. It's going to mean some additional revenue, and I think people have to start thinking and talking about that. We have had a 5% cert tax, this current fiscal year. The assumption I told you about earlier was assuming no surtax. That is the 17 million balance that we have right now. And there are some other potential sources of revenue, but read my lips, we have to have some new sources of revenue.
Continuing on the topic of tax reform from the Senate side of the picture, I've asked Senator Mike Halligan, please.
Thank you, Pat. As chairman of the Senate Taxation Committee, we normally would have seen lots of income tax, lots of property tax reform, but fortunately for us, or perhaps unfortunately, in some cases, because we haven't been involved as intimately in the discussions, but the House has carried through their subcommittees most of the discussions and the analytical work on the income and property tax packages that you'll probably end up seeing. But as Bob had indicated, our revenue deadlines are the 71st legislative day. We have about 3 more weeks of working on tax issues in the Senate and the House before we pass them over between the houses. I think before the session started, people were saying, all the newspapers and most of the press were saying, there's probably not going to be any income tax reform done this session. There's probably not going to be any property tax reform done this session, and most other tax reform, such as a sales tax, probably will not even be considered. I think income tax reform is a very serious issue to Democrats this session. That's why the subcommittees have been working on it. I'm confident that the House is going to pass over and the Senate will adopt in a reasonable form the income tax package that they give us, which will be perhaps a percentage of the federal system in some way. I think we're going to consolidate some property tax classes and make it more simplistic, make it more equitable. So I think Democrats are going to do that, and we're going to put something on the governor's desk that is going to be far-reaching. It's something we've talked about for 10, 15, 20 years and just haven't done. And I think that is going to be something that people will look to the Democrats for leadership on, and we're going to do that. Right now, we're trying to decide where our revenue picture is, and we'll know that in a couple of weeks, I think, once we find out where the spending side is. And I think we know what we want to do for the university system. I think we kind of know where we'd like to go with the pay plan. It's more than what the governor offered. and K through 12 certainly needs to get more than what the governor has said that they're going to get. It's just a matter of, will we be able to share that responsibility with the governor, or is he going to put the burden on us? And I think Democrats are willing to accept that leadership. We'd like to get the governor involved in those things, but right now he seems to be dragging his feet on the no new taxes issues, and we're going to take him to task on that. I think we're going to go directly at him with some tax issues that he's going to have a hard time not signing. In the Senate, to talk about some specific issues, we've got some pension bills in there. In fact, we've heard 3 pension bills, and there's a major one in the House, and we have yet to deal then with the pension issue that the United States Supreme Court dealt all of the states who were taxing federal pensioners, and that's something that we'll work on in the next couple of weeks. The oil and gas, right in the following few days here, once we get back, I've got the major cigarette tax bill of Senator Tao's up on Tuesday, and that's to add 25 cents, the one that was not adopted in last November, and that'll be up Tuesday at 8 o'clock in the morning. And then on Friday, we've got the coal tax freeze up, freeze the coal tax at 20%. And that's, I think, a $25 million item that potentially is a revenue source. Let me just give you some numbers. A surtax, if we were to keep the surtax in place, is about $25 to $30 million over the biennium. So that's a possible revenue source. The oil and gas tax holiday that the governor wants is potentially an $8 million item that we would lose if we gave it. So if we hold firm on that one, we potentially could keep that $8 million. I said the coal tax was potentially a $25 million item. Only about 12 of that would actually go to the state. The rest would go to local governments and schools. The miscellaneous taxes, such as the cigarette tax, I have no idea how they will fare. I really don't, or at what level a cigarette tax would pass if it were to. So that's something that you'll get a chance to read about and perhaps come over and participate in the next few days. There's a video tax you saw in the paper today, 5% on a video rental. I don't anticipate that going anywhere, but it'll be interesting to see how many hundreds of people come out. There's going to be busloads there for that. Local option taxes, just to talk about another specific item, the Senate did pass over to the House for the first time, I think, ever, allowing local governments the ability to do sales, income, and property taxes on their own with a vote of the people. Now, it's controversial, but I think it was incumbent on the Senate to show some leadership there and make everything part of the picture, and that's the comprehensive tax proposal for local governments, for states, or for the state, and I think we did that. Gambling as another revenue source, there's some serious consideration of possibly looking at the state's percentage that we currently get from the gambling machines, and so that will be a controversial topic that we will deal with in the next few weeks. I mean, we're looking for simplicity, for balance, for fairness, and for equity, and I think that's where Democrats are going to be. Francis Bardino gave us some good advice when we got over there in our huge majority, said if you want to come over and just go out and run rampant and roughshod over people, we won't be back in the same numbers that we are this time, and that's what happened back in 1975. So I think there's going to be some restraint and some caution, but we also want to make sure that we act like Democrats and not like Republicans. And speaking of that, I noticed you got Kadas in a tie today. It's a rare opportunity to see Kadas on a Sunday with a tie on. I don't know when his gubernatorial campaign will start, but I'll maybe let him talk about that.
A topic presumably closely related to tax reform is that of economic development. One would think that revenue pictures certainly brighten if economic development occurs. On that particular topic area, I've asked Representative Stella Jean Hansen to speak.
Thank you. And my good friends out in the audience, it's so nice to see you all after being gone for so long. Economic development is an area that I have served on every session that I've been in the legislature. As you know, I serve on the business committee. And I represent House District 57, which also includes the whole downtown business area. So we have had some interesting bills. I spend many more hours in that committee than I do any of the others. Some of the business bills that we have had in that were rather interesting, and probably the two that we've had the biggest hearings on, was one on log scaling, which we hope we came out with a bill that will at least alleviate some of the fears and correct some of the equities between the log haulers and the manufacturers are those that process the logs. The second one that we had was a big hearing and an interesting hearing, and that was on warranty work for your automobiles. I tremble a little as I talk about this bill because the automobile dealers in the state of Montana, particularly in Missoula too, were there in force. And I think the way this bill came out may have some repercussions for them. But I hope will correct some of the inequity between the amount of money that the manufacturers pay on warranty work and the amount of money it actually costs the dealerships. And obviously they were losing a lot of money on their warranty work, and we hope this will correct it. But then to move on to economic development, those are just some of the bills that we've worked on there. I don't know how many insurance bills, but I'm sure none of you are really interested in insurance. I'm not. But in the area of economic development, in the business committee, we have a special committee, which Don Larson and I both serve on economic development. So we have had some interesting sessions, and people speak to us on economic development. You know, when we started out in '83, we talked about getting that coal tax money to the people who could start businesses in Montana. And actually, that's where economic development really is today. If you look back over what we've done since '83, it's pretty minimal. Also, we've come to realize that the huge businesses from out of the state of Montana are not going to come in and rescue you. Your economy is not going to get better, and I wish I could say it is, but I think if anything is done in the area of economic development, we are, like they say in the welfare department, we are going to have to pull ourselves up from the bootstraps. They keep talking about Montana as part of the empty quarter. The empty quarter, nothing in there, nothing to work with, and it'll be bypassed. The world economy has changed so fast and so drastically, and we have been so completely left out of it, that the prospects of us really improving our economy much are pretty bleak. However, we're going to work at it, and I think it can be rescued, but I think it's going to have to require a lot of guts on the part of the people in the state of Montana and legislators, the governor, and we have got to get our act together if we are going to do anything for Montana in the area of economic development. One of the things we have got to do is provide capital. The capital is not there. I learned in '83 that the problem with economic development was capital. It's not taxes. Believe me, it's not taxes. It isn't our poor business climate, it's the lack of money. Mike Kadas has had a bill in our committee, a micro-business bill, which I think will help get some of that coal tax out to small businesses, which is really where it's at in Montana and actually in the rest of the United States. If you stop and look at the statistics of economies in the other states, it's the same thing. It's the small businessman that hires 5 to 10 to 20 people that really are the mainstay of our economies. You know, if we spin our wheels much more on foreign economies, the Pacific Rim and so forth, I think we're really going to, the western Montana as well as eastern Montana is going to slip into that empty quarter. Now the maps that they show us show the western part of Montana and the far western part out of that terrible black hole. But the majority of eastern Montana is in it. North Dakota, South Dakota, Utah, Wyoming, and we're considered the same as we're out of the desert country in the Far East as places in Europe and Russia that they figure the economy has gone so far now it can't be rescued. So I guess that's one of my greatest concerns over at the legislature this session. I had the privilege on Thursday, after having spent a nice little vacation at Fairmont, of going to Butte and taking a look at the pit. Fritz Daly from Butte had a bill in to try and do something about the water in the pit. I was absolutely flabbergasted. We're getting closer and closer to the stage where that may just go over the lowest part of that pit. Also, it's pretty devastating when you look at what Washington Construction and so forth is doing up there. So if we're talking about rescuing this state in any way, we have got to deal with what's happening in Butte. We have got to deal with our natural resources. Every time we let a log, every time we let a cow, a sheep, so forth out of this state and do not process it ourselves, we're giving our economic development away to those companies on the East Coast and West Coast are going to do this for us. I don't know how we're really going to do it. We hope that when we come out of this session, we have a plan for Montana for economic development. It's not going to be easy, and it's going to require a lot of cooperation.
Continuing on the topic of economic development, Representative Don Larson.
Thank you, Pat. Stella Jean stole most of my thunder and accurately identified the problems that are facing the Economic Development Committee in the House of Representatives. A couple of observations as a freshman are that I'm curious that all the impetus for economic development policy is coming from the Democrats and not the Republicans. That seems to be something of a flip-flop. My pet bill this session is a value-added bill, which goes right along with what Stella Jean Hansen has been saying. I've submitted a major piece of potential legislation in a value-added bill. Basically, it would give tax incentives to basic industries that add value to a primary Montana product. This would apply to the agricultural, the lumber logging, and the mining sectors alike. And the bill was selected by an economic development panel as one of those that should be targeted for amendment and passage. And it's one of a package of bills that we, as Democrats, are developing to land on the governor's desk about the 80th day. I think it's a very important piece of legislation. From my own standpoint, I sit also on the Business Committee and have watched many bills come through that pertain directly to economic development. And they're getting strong endorsement from the Democrats, and I find that very refreshing. From a personal standpoint, I'm watching very carefully what's happening in the timber sector because I have the Bonner Mill and the Pyramid Lumber Company mill in my district. And I find it kind of ironic that the Bonner Mill has closed temporarily, not because of a supply problem, but because of a demand problem. There's no demand for the products that they're manufacturing out there, and that's a temporary condition, I'm certain, but we have to address ourselves as part of the international market. I've also carried several bills for the rural fire districts on another note. Although they don't pertain to economic development, they do pertain directly to our district, and I've been pleased to carry successfully a half a dozen bills for the rural firefighters in Montana. As an aside, Howard and I are the two freshmen in this delegation, and I find it curious that of the 40-plus freshmen over in Helena, Howard and I have introduced the most bills. Now, I don't know what that means, but I think you should be proud that Howard's such an active person. And I also want to make another comment. The House of Representatives is broken up into several different delegations, the Butte delegation, the Great Falls, the Missoula, the Billings. And I have to commend you. You have some very good delegates here in this body of people. They each seem to have developed a different expertise, and they all kind of interlock and coordinate their skills and their expertise so that we have a fairly comprehensive coverage of the issues over in Helena. And so I think you should be very proud of this delegation.
Moving now from the private sector more over to the public sector, some of the issues that are before the legislature now have to do with state employees. Representative Vicki Cocchiarella has some particular interest in those issues.
I want to echo what Stella Jean said. It's nice to see everyone here. Not only that, it's nice to see you when you come to Helena. And it's even more exciting when you open the mail and it's from someone in Missoula. And I think that one of the issues that's created a lot of mail recently is state employee pay. I think it's an economic development issue too. In Missoula, with the university being one of the largest employer at this time, it's important that the people who work for the university system are paid with the idea that they're paid like the rest of the employees in the state, whether they're in the private or public sector. I served on an interim study committee, governor's committee, that's looked at the issue of compensation for state employees for the last year and a half. And in Montana, state employees receive anywhere from 10 to 40% behind the local and regional market. What's happening with pay at this point is that it's in a subcommittee, and we're dealing with several bills in that subcommittee to come up with a way to make up for lots of lost time when it comes to pay for state employees. Those bills eventually will come out of that subcommittee in some form that includes all state employees, including university faculty, which was a certain group that was left out last time. Hopefully what we'll do with pay is provide lots of catch-up. State employees have had their pay frozen 2 times in the last four terms or 4 bienniums. We've had 8% increases in the last 7 years when inflation has been over 22%. State employees, the problem created by loss of pay is retention and recruitment. We're finding that quite frequently we are recruiting, training, and sending away the best employees to work next to a stool next to them for the federal government or for the private sector when we've spent the money in the state to train that person. We need to deal with the problems of recruitment and retention in all levels of state government, mostly because the people in the state of Montana aren't expecting less service, they're expecting and demanding more and higher quality service. If the people in the state were saying, hey, I don't need that and I don't care about how I'm treated and it's not important to me, I don't mind standing in lines, it would be different. But the state of Montana have come to expect and have all along gotten good service from state employees. It's not popular to say that state employees deserve more money. It's not one of those politically good things to go around talking about, but the facts and figures are in that state employees are far, far behind the private sector in the state and the region. So we're working really hard on that subcommittee. I hope within the next couple of weeks something will come out. As you've heard the sad stories of revenue, I'm not sure where we'll get the money to fund those state employee pay plans when we're through with that, but it should be a priority, and we need to make it a priority in the legislature, and I think that it will be one of the big 3 that will receive a lot of attention, I hope, real soon, because state employees have felt all along that they have had the budget balanced on their backs for a long time. So I think that you'll be hearing something from that subcommittee within the next couple weeks. Another thing that I've participated in that's been really exciting in the House is the Democratic Women's Caucus, and this caucus is made up of women in the House and Senate, and we have formulated 2 packages of bills that we are working to push through the legislature this time. One is a family package that we've adopted and will present to both caucuses in the House, and the Democratic caucuses in the House and Senate. And this family package, or this package of bills, includes family issues, crime issues, and issues related to the Democratic platform. And we've spent the first half of the legislature identifying, studying the bills, putting this package together, and hope that the entire Democratic caucus in the House and Senate will adopt that package of bills as our focus from now on until the end of the session. And then the women's side has adopted a women's package of bills that we're working on: women's rights, kids' rights, taking care of senior citizens, and those are also part of the package that will present both caucuses. We, as Democratic women, felt that we needed to have a support group. We felt we needed to be able to come together as another kind of delegation, and we feel that we can have some power by sticking together. Our Democratic Women's Caucus is attended by men and women in the legislature. It's not a unisex group. So we are feeling successful and seeing that some of our efforts have paid off so far in some of the legislation that was recently passed last week.
Another topic in the public sector arena of considerable interest are health insurance concerns in this state as well as nationwide. Representative Carolyn Squires has some particular interest in that topic.
It's nice to see everybody, and hello, and I'm Carolyn Squires from House District 58. This is my 3rd term in the legislature, and of the 3 terms that I've been there, I've served on the Health and Human Services Committee. And I think two interesting proposals have been presented to our committee, one of them being the nursing home bed tax on senior citizens, $1 a day. That was presented to us and indicating that it would garner $8 worth of federal dollars. Now, I'm not sure exactly what kind of shell game is going on here, but I'm not really receptive to that particular concept. The other issue that really bothers me an awful lot is that there are approximately 144,000 people in the state of Montana that are uninsured. It's despicable to me to think that there are these kinds of things happening to our Montanans. There is a proposal by the governor, a possibility of acquiring some type of insurance, possibly from Blue Cross, whoever may bid on the particular project or proposal, that there could be a possible $250 deductible and probably $57 for the one individual. That's just a projection based on what the company, whatever the company proposes. And this will only take care of 2,000 to 3,000 people in the state of Montana. I think it's a must that we take a look at the rest of our citizenry there that are in the state of Montana. They're the working poor, people who are working at minimum wage jobs, $5, $6 an hour, that can't do it. And where do they go? So therefore, these are two proposals proposed by the governor to solve these particular problems. Another interesting thing that happens in the Health and Human Services Committee is the Department of Family Services comes in and makes a request for additional funding in foster care. The Department of SRS comes in and asks for additional funding for welfare. What is interesting about this is if you question these people from the bureaucracy and ask them, is it in the governor's budget, they'll tell you, no, it's not. So therefore, you know what kind of a position that it puts Democrats in. There are issues that Democrats care extremely much about and are looking at a way at funding. And again, like the talk has been here, the dollars aren't all there, folks, and we're going to have to make some real rough, tough decisions. Do we forfeit what the things that we want to do for the poor, for the less fortunate, or do we just totally ignore them and present them 1/3 of a package? These are decisions that we will make in the next 45 days, and they're scary for me. I have prioritized my issues, and my number one priority issue is the social service area. My district is that kind of a district. My district is a low-income district with working-class people who need these benefits. So you know where my emphasis will be placed. Also, I'd like to talk to you just briefly about the committee that I chair. I chair the Labor Committee, Labor and Employment Committee. I think we've done some remarkable things in that particular committee this time under the guidance of Representative Jerry Driscoll, the House Majority Leader. There's been a vast revamping of the workers' comp system, and let me tell you, it's to the benefit of the worker. There's also been reform in the unemployment insurance portion of the law. Again, that's to the benefit of the worker. We have sent to the Senate some very fine bills, and I hope that they will address them kindly, and that they will also pass them, and that they will get past the governor as well. Another area that my particular committee in labor has addressed is the privatization issue. We have 3 bills there that we consider a package. One being, if a worker is dislocated from a state agency, that there will be some type of relocation assistance. The issue of privatization itself, and also how the bids for privatization will be taken care of. We consider this a very good package, and again hope that it will be taken into consideration. We dealt with the issue of the closure of Galen. That bill was tabled in our committee. We also dealt with the issue of prison labor in that committee, and that also was tabled. I have found some very fine, new, wonderful friends in my relationships. I've enjoyed my chairmanship, and let me tell you, it's really good to see you folks. Thank you.
An issue of importance statewide, but certainly particularly to Missoulians, relates to the university system and education in general. Representative Mike Kadas has some particular expertise in that area.
Thanks, Pat. First of all, I want to thank Senator Halligan for his advice on my ill-fated gubernatorial attempt. It's always good to get advice from someone who's been there.
do want to thank all of you for coming. I know a lot of you worked on campaigns. I just like to note that both our two new first-timers, we don't call them freshmen anymore, but Howard and Don have really kind of picked up the ball and done a lot of work. I think we've got about twice as many people in the delegation as we did 10 years ago. And so Missoula County is really making an impact on the state legislature, and I think that has to do with a lot of you out there. And keep it up. There's another couple of seats we haven't got yet, but let's get them. I also want to thank KACI for showing up. I have been extremely disappointed in the media this session. KACI used to have a reporter stationed at the Capitol who covered the session. They pulled him. The coverage of the session seems to get worse every year. I think if you ask people in the delegation, about all of us subscribe to the Tribune, not only during the session, but during the interim. And I think it's appalling that we can't get legislative issues and state government issues covered in Missoula. I think it's really damaging the ability of Missoulians to react to what's going on in the state of Montana. And I would encourage KCI to put a reporter back into Helena. It would, I think, be a real benefit to the state of Montana and to Missoula in particular. Let me talk a little bit about the appropriations process. That's the committee I spend most of my time with. In the first 45 days, we've gone through the subcommittees, where there are 6 subcommittees, and we have tried to look at the budgets in some detail. And the subcommittees are all done now, and they will be reporting their recommended budgets to the full Appropriations Committee. Those hearings will start in the next week and go on for about 3 weeks. The full committee will then pass that bill on to the House. The full House will have to act on that bill by the 67th day. It's about the 3rd week of March. This is really the time to have your input on the appropriations process. Once it gets much past the House, the Senate can tinker with it and change it some, but there probably won't be a lot of big changes. The Senate likes to say they fixed the House mistakes. Generally what they do is add a little more money into the budget, and we all go home. And no doubt they'll fix some of our mistakes, and we'll make some. But the real hard part of the budget process is coming upon us in the very near future. Someone noted there are 3 really big pieces in the budget left to do: the pay plan, university funding, and the foundation program, or K through 12 funding. At this point, we do not have the revenue to be able to accommodate all of the requests made, particularly by those groups. And that will be an ongoing process to see if we can come up with that revenue and to see if we can convince the governor that it's absolutely necessary to do that. As far as university funding, the subcommittee has essentially put money into the budget to cover mandated costs of the university system. The largest chunk of that was about $8 million for faculty salaries of a contract that was signed over 2 years ago. Those costs have been arbitrated and settled, and they are binding. We have to pay them. And so we put the money in for that. We added additional money for additional insurance costs. We added additional money for additional enrollment. They're system-wide types of things that can't be avoided. We've done very few individual campus-specific type modifications. The 3 major areas of funding for the university system come in House Bill 2, which is what we've been working on so far, in the pay plan, which funds our classified salaries, salary increases, and our faculty salary increases. And then I think there will be a final piece this session that usually isn't a part of the whole equation, but that will be a separate piece of legislation that is tied to some revenue source that appropriates additional dollars to the university system. The university system is at a very difficult place. We are faced with the question of quality, essentially. If
we want to maintain quality, we have to do one of two things. We have to increase the number of dollars we're putting into the system, or we're going to have to reduce the number of students. I don't see any way around that question. I have tried hard during this session to force that part of the debate out into the open so that all of you have the opportunity to participate in that very difficult question of whether we're going to raise taxes for the university system or whether we're going to eliminate the number of students. And I guess I would ask you to think about that hard. I don't think it is an easy question to answer, but to participate in that dialogue. Regarding K through 12 funding, I think again that is going to be wrapped up in some kind of a revenue package as we get down to the final days. I don't see the money being available to fund Nancy Keenan's request of 4.8 inflationary increases. On the other hand, I think we have to do something better than the governor's level of 0 and 0, but to do that is going to take additional revenue. And so I think that question probably will not be decided until the very end of the session. One of the ways I know that we're considering in the House of trying to fund some additional money into K through 12 is to put back in place net and gross proceeds, which are our property taxes on oil and coal and natural gas. We removed those last session and replaced them with a local government severance tax as part of the House Bill 28 that was the response to the underfunded school suit that was upheld unanimously by the Supreme Court. I think that was a mistake. I think it was a mistake that we couldn't avoid politically. It was the one thing that the governor absolutely insisted on, and that was kind of his part of the deal in the whole school funding system. Because of that, I think it will be difficult for us to get around his veto pen on this issue, but I think we have to give it a try. Let me finish with an economic development area. Stella Jean mentioned the micro-business bill that I put in. I think it's important to remember that, well, first of all, let me tell you what that bill does. We'll provide loans of $20,000 or less for businesses of 10 or fewer employees with net proceeds of less than $500,000 a year. It is truly a small business development bill. Missoula has the preeminent small business development group in the state, WEDCO, Women's Economic Development Group. They have the experience and have been doing this kind of work for the last couple of years and have an excellent track record. That's the kind of program that the micro-business development bill will be going towards. It is kind of ironic. Last session that bill was sponsored by Democratic Speaker of the House John Vincent, passed the House on a very large vote, got 79 votes. It needed to get 75, but it got 79, and died in the Senate because of party politics. Since that time, the governor came around and realized that well, maybe was a good bill. And so he is the requester of my bill, essentially. It says requested by the governor. I'm the chief sponsor. Almost all of the legislative leadership, both Democratic and Republican, are sponsoring that bill, and hopefully it will fare a little better and won't get bogged down in the partisan politics at the end of the session. I'll leave that to the Republican senators to decide, though. Thank you.
We've heard a great deal of information today, and so I'm passing the rather enormous task of summing up the Democratic prospects of the legislature and how we hope things are going to go in the near future to Senator Van Valkenberg.
Thank you, Pat. I'm Fred Van Valkenberg, Senate District 30. I also want to express my appreciation for your attendance and hope that we still have some time for some questions and some answer before we close out here. Pat asked me to kind of wrap up the Democratic effort so far and try and give you some predictions on where we're going. Before I do that, I would like to begin by making some comments about the lack of unnecessary partisanship during the first half of the session. While the war was going on, and thank goodness it's now over with. There was, I think, a real effort in the legislature in particular, but I think the country as a whole, to try and avoid unnecessary partisanship, and that there was considerable acceptance and delight almost in that on the part of Montana citizens to avoid that kind of partisanship. It happened for reasons besides the war. There's been a change in leadership in the legislature, and the substantial Democratic majorities have made it harder for the Republicans to kind of advance some things, but it has had the effect of allowing legislators in Montana to work together unlike they have for at least a decade, if not longer. And I hope that the start of that effort will work to everyone's benefit as we go into the tougher issues, the revenue and spending issues in the second half of the session. I think that we should all kind of learn some of the lessons that this war has taught us, so that we can differ over policies on how to reach goals, but we ought not differ over the goals, and that once a policy has been adopted, that we all ought to pull together to try and implement that policy and bring about the goal that we're seeking. And I think in Montana, one of the primary goals that we're after is to try and provide a good education to our citizens. We don't have, as others have indicated, some of the job opportunities and the economic opportunities that are elsewhere. But when we put an emphasis on education, at least we give our youth the skills and the abilities to be competitive, whether it's in Montana or wherever else. And increasingly, those people who, if they've had to leave Montana, are finding ways to come back to Montana because they know that the quality of life in this state is extremely good compared to other places. And we can't let our quality of life deteriorate because things get discouraging at times. We can't just say, we're not going to worry about our environment, or we're not going to worry about our relationships with one another because of our interest in making money. It is our strength. It's what makes us the kind of place that people want to live and want to come back to at all times. Now, those are often conflicting goals, and conflicting goals are among the most difficult for people to resolve, but they can be resolved with hard work and dedication and willingness to make sacrifice. And some of the sacrifice, I think, that we have to think about making at times is to pay more in the short run in terms of taxes in order to get something in the long run in terms of adequate government services, both in the educational arena, but in a lot of human areas also. And so as we go into the final days of the session, we're going to be talking about the need to ask Montanans to make a sacrifice, to pay more in taxes than they're currently paying or will have to pay in this current year in order to fund some of those things. Now, I have some confidence that even people that have been laid off at Champion, at Bonner, and Libby understand from their experience in the labor field that it doesn't do them any good to say that employees at the university shouldn't get a raise because they're temporarily out of work. We all have to pull together. We have to stand by those workers and make sure that we provide every bit of assistance that we can to them, and we've got to recognize the fact that people at the university have gone for a long time without any kind of adequate raise, and that sort of pent-up demand needs to be recognized. We've got to, I think, do this on the basis of one's ability to pay. I do not expect that we're going to be going in and raising taxes simply for the sake of raising taxes. We're going to look at fairness issues and look primarily at the income tax as the means by which we raise the revenue that's necessary. And we may well differ with the governor, and he may win in the end if all the Republican legislators stand beside him and decide that they're not going to try and solve the problems that exist. I hope they won't do that. I hope they'll join us in an effort to solve the problems. But if the governor and the Republicans win in the next 6 weeks, we can't let the fight end there. The fight has to go on. There's an election next year, and it's very important that we understand that that election is as important as anything that happens in the next 2 months. That if we care about Montana, want to make Montana a better place to live, a better place for our children to grow up, then we have to care about the political system, and we've got to want to try to do the right thing. I'm confident that the people that you've elected want to do that, and I hope that all of you will stick with us. Thank you very much.
We should all be quite pleased to have the opportunity to hear our legislators speak with such candor. I would urge all of you to convey your feelings regarding the various topics that your representatives have discussed today. Please consider writing or calling the delegation in Helena anytime soon. Montana's distinguished progressive system will only become stronger through such dialogue. Thank you.